everyone, welcome to A Little Bit of Monica. Today is the long-awaited day. It's finally time to go over my top books of 2024. I read 172 books last year, and that's the most books I've ever read in one year. And I somehow was tasked with narrowing that down to come up with my favorite books of the year, which was nearly an impossible task because I'm terrible at making decisions. And I took this so personally. I looked at some books and said, I feel like I'm personally offending you if I don't rank you higher. So I had a lot of trouble putting books above each other in this listing, but I managed to do it. So what we're going to do today is we are going to do my top 24 of 2024. This is going to include 14 honorable mentions and then my very top 10, which will be in order. The honorable mentions, I am not ranking those in order because I can't possibly do that. But the top 10 will be ranked from 10 to number 1, my favorite book of the year. I don't want to waste any more time before getting into this, so we are going to jump right into the honorable mentions, and I'm going to go by genre for these just to make it a little bit easier. So starting off with the genre that had the least number of books in my top books of the year, it was the thrillers. I only had 2 books that made this list, one of which is an honorable mention, and that was When She Was Me by Marley Bush. This was an arc I read like midway through the year, and I absolutely loved it, and it's still stuck in my mind. This is about 2 sisters who live in a cabin in the woods, and when another family moves into a cabin right down the way, memories start to flood back about things from the past, and they have to face a new problem here in the present day. And this book is just full of so many twists and turns, but the environment was so eerie. Being set in the woods with this cabin setting, it just felt so creepy all the time, but the twists were absolutely incredible. I loved the characters and the dynamics, but especially that setting really set it apart for me. So that is why this one made it into the list. But now we are going to go straight into the horrors. I have 5 horror books that made it into my honorable mentions list. Starting off, we're gonna keep on the arc train here, and the first one is another arc that I read, and this was The Haunting of Elkwood by Gwendolyn Kist. Now this book I read very early on in the year, and I loved it. Again, this one is an environmental kind of genius. This story is about a street that disappears behind a veil, and there are only 3 young women who survived the night. And now 20 years later, they are going to return to the scene and be involved in an investigation into what lies beyond the veil. There is going to be so much creepiness going on, but there's also a lot of just surprising storytelling. But one of my favorite elements of this book is the relationships and the dynamics there between the 3 best friends and how they have survived over the 20 years since everything happened, and their entire lives were uprooted when everyone and everything they knew disappeared behind this veil. But then there's also a lot of other relationships that get explored, and I thought this was really, really well done. And overall, it just felt very creepy, and the Haunting of Elkwood was just very well titled because it was a very haunting type of story. Next up was Boys in the Valley by Philip Fracassi, and this one I also read like earlier on in the year, and it has stuck with me since. There are scenes that still live in my head, and I can't get rid of them because it was so creepy and disturbing. This is about a school for the boys, and a lot of really dark and twisted things are going to be happening to these boys. A lot of it is kind of like religious trauma based, and I thought that that element was very, very strong here. It was very disturbing, and some of the scenes between the boys and the adults that worked there, it was just all so messed up, and I loved it. Sometimes it had me questioning what's wrong with me that I do love this kind of a story so much, but it was just so good. I devoured it very, very quickly. I loved it despite how absolutely bizarre and wild it was. Next up is a book by one of my very favorite horror authors. I have loved every single thing I've ever read from Darcy Coates, including Where He Can't Find You. This was her YA debut, and I read it earlier on in the year. And again, these books that I read early in the year, the fact that they translated all the way through the year still being some of my favorite books should tell you a lot about them. This book feels very similar to like an It by Stephen King, where it's a cast of young kids, teenagers, who are basically tasked with finding out what's going on when people start going missing or winding up dead. And when the main character's sister gets taken, that's what sets everything off. And her friends are now going to try to save the sister. And it's just really creepy. There's lots of little rules about, curfews and being safe, and they are going to go into the depths to figure out what is really haunting this town. And I loved the story. I love the setting, the environment. It's one of my favorite things about Darcy Coates is the creepy environment that she can build. And so this was incredible, and I loved reading this, especially as a YA, because I feel like YA horror for me doesn't typically hit as hard, but this one, it really did hit for me. I loved it. Now, I just mentioned It by Stephen King, and while it did not make the cut, it definitely did not make the cut for my favorite books of the year, I do have 2 Stephen King books that made the honorable mentions list. So the first one is 11/22/63. This one is like 800 pages long. This feels more like a historical fiction kind of horror because it's about an English teacher who finds a way to go back in time to the years leading up to the JFK assassination, and he goes back in time to prevent that assassination from happening. So there's a lot of like politics going into this. There's a lot of spying and secrecy and trying to get to the bottom of conspiracies and everything like that. But somehow this book still managed to have a fast pace that kept me absolutely invested from one page to the next. I loved it. I had so much fun. This is one of those books that when people haven't read Stephen King before, a lot of people recommend you start with this one. And I am not going to argue with that suggestion. I do think this one's a really fun way to start, especially if you like things like time traveling or history. All of that combines into this book to make it an absolutely incredible read. But that's not the only book that made it onto this list, because in December I read The Shining and I loved The Shining. I think I actually liked this one a little bit more than 11/22/63, although I go back and forth sometimes because they're very, very different. This one is a winter setting where a family is going to this overlook hotel where the father is going to be the caretaker for the winter, but things are not as they seem at this hotel and things are going to go sour real quick. The father is going to descend into madness while the mother and the son are trying to stay away from him as best they can. And I feel like if you've seen the movie, reading the book feels so different because the book focuses so much more on Danny, the son, the little boy, and the movie focuses more on the dad. Now, I think both are very, very integral parts of the story, but the book, I think, balances all three of the members of this family very, very well in showing how important they are to the story and how it carries itself and all the horrific things that are going to happen. I loved this book. I thought that the suspense especially was one of the most beautiful things. It kept me captivated, like from start to finish. That brings me to the end of the horror books that are in the honorable mentions. Next, we are going to move on to the fantasy honorable mentions. I have 3 honorable mentions for this category, starting off with Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. I heard the hype for this book and it did not let me down. Honestly, I loved reading this book. This is about a witch and a witch hunter. And if that doesn't tell you enough about the kind of dynamic that's going to be going on in this book, I love everything about our 2 main characters here. Basically, our female main character, Rune, is a very well-known, infamous witch. And she is parading as a socialite. So she is pretending to not be a witch, but she ends up meeting the witch hunter who is hunting her, but he doesn't know that he's hunting her. And then chaos ensues, and I absolutely ate it up. I am so excited for the sequel to be coming out this year because I loved this book so much. And that's obviously why it ended up on this list, because I devoured this book. I devoured it so quickly because I did not want to put it down. Once I got into it, I didn't want to stop reading. And the same goes for this next one, The Games Gods Play by Abigail Owen. I loved this book. I had an incredible time reading this. This book is about a competition, which is automatically a buzzword for me, but this is where each of the gods choose a mortal to compete for them on their behalf in a game every 100 years, and Hades is going to participate for the first time like ever, and he's going to pick a mortal to compete. I love the dynamic in here. I love the competition. Every single phase of the competition felt so exciting. The chapters in this book were so short that it felt like the story itself moved so rapidly, and I was eating it up. Okay, short chapters make a story go faster. I'm just gonna say it. It's the truth. And that is exactly how this felt. But at the same time, I was loving sitting in the story. Like, it could have been a little slower because of how much I loved reading it. And when we got to the end, the cliffhanger, I'm very excited for book 2 to also be coming out this year so that I can read it hopefully as soon as possible. I had so much fun with this. This was the pretty first edition from Red Tower, and I'm really glad that this book ended up being as pretty on the inside as it was on the outside. And the same goes for the next one on my list. This is the final book of the fantasy honorable mentions, The Night Ends with Fire by KX Song. This book I had pre-ordered for so long because I saw the pretty first edition and I was like, I must have that. And then I got it, and then I got a special edition from Fairy Loot, and it's also so stunning, as well as the story. I loved the story of this book. This is very much a Mulan retelling, and if you know Disney's Mulan movie, you know a lot of the events that are going to happen in this book because there are some scenes that are very similar, I will admit. However, I love the way they were written. Okay, I love the character dynamics. I loved all of it. I've always loved Mulan, and so having those things happen in the book, it just made it better for me. I really enjoyed this. This book is going to have the main character, Maylin, who instead of marrying a very aggressive and violent man, she decides to disguise herself as a boy and join the army in her father's place. Yes, it's a very familiar story, but then while she's training, she is going to end up developing a bit of a relationship, some feelings for her training partner, who is also consequently the prince. And that's going to set off a whole new slew of events, and I loved all of them. I thought this book was fast-paced, it was exciting, I loved all of the dynamics, and the magical element that goes into this based off of the Legend of Mulan was just incredible. I loved how this was done, and I was so glad that the outsides again matched the inside. Now we get into the final category of honorable mentions, and that is my romance books. Now for this one, I have 5 books on my honorable mention. The first one was another arc that I read, Edge of Chaos by Molly E. Lee. Now this one, the sole reason that it made it onto this list and why I loved it so much is because it was about tornadoes and tornado chasers. And I have always been fascinated by the weather, and specifically tornadoes and any movies that have to do with tornadoes. So when a book was about tornadoes, you can bet I was on it. I loved this book. I thought the dynamic was fantastic. This is about a storm chaser and a girl who's in a very toxic relationship, but who also loves chasing storms, just doesn't have the opportunity. And when they team up, it is a storm all its own. I loved this book. I loved the dynamics. I thought it was fun. It was witty and bantery, and it was fantastic. Plus tornadoes. So like, I have no complaints, no notes. Next up on the list, we have Abby Jimenez's Just for the Summer. Now, this book is about 2 people who are very bad at relationships, AKA they are always the person that someone dates right before they find the person that they end up with forever. So they end up teaming up to see if they can reverse each other's love curses, and I love how this all turns out. There's a lot of really complicated family dynamics that go into the story, and one of the things that makes Abby Jimenez's books so incredible to me is the real life, I don't want to say trauma, but difficulty, the things that they face that feel so real and realistic, and I love how it played out in this book. There are some complicated parental roles, sibling roles, and then navigating a relationship at the same time. I loved this story. I cried. I also read this at like 2 a.m., so I was a little delirious when I was reading it, but I have remembered it since, and that tells you a lot. If my 2 a.m., 3 a.m. barely surviving brain can comprehend this book and love it months and months later, you know it was a good one. And with Abby Jimenez, of course it was going to be a good one. And now the next book is one that I'm just going to give you a little bit of a spoiler hint. This isn't a series, and another book from the series made it into my top 10. So this is not the only time you're going to see the series in this video, but Heartless by Elsie Silver. This is the Chestnut Springs series, and I read all 5 of the books right in a row. And so then I was faced with the task of comparing them one against another, and this one became my second favorite. Now this one definitely was my favorite for a long time. This is a single dad romance, which I didn't know how much I was gonna love that until it was in front of me, and then yeah, I loved it. Okay, it's also a cowboy romance, and I was eating it up. I entered my cowboy era at that point, and there was no turning back, and now I'm just here forever, and I love it. This is the very typical kind of story where the semi-irresponsible nanny steps in to help take care of the single dad's kid, but then they end up falling in love instead, and I was just having the most fun with this. I loved this book. I loved the dynamics. I loved getting to see the actual like familial dynamics between Cade, the father, and the son, but also Cade and his father. I thought that all of these things were just incredible, and this book was amazing. But like I said, it's not the only book from the series that's going to make this list, but the other one will come a little bit later. Next up, we have Funny Story by Emily Henry. This is definitely my favorite Emily Henry that I've read so far. I loved this book. This is about 2 people whose relationships end because their significant others end up together. And then the 2 of them form an unlikely bond, become besties, and then fall in love. And honestly, same, because I loved both of these characters. I loved the dynamic, the setting, all of the things that went into it, and it's got a little bit of fake dating in there, which is one of my favorite romance tropes. So of course this one was a hit for me. I just had so much fun, and honestly, the first time that I read an Emily Henry, I liked it, but I didn't love it. This one, absolutely loved it, clearly, because it made this list. And this one, I'm so glad that I have the Afterlight Special Edition because it is beautiful, and so is the story on the inside. And now the last honorable mention for romance. This one was another arc that I read, Wish I Were Here by Melissa Weisner. Now, this book really surprised me. I did not expect to love this as much as I did. This is a magical realism kind of romance in which the main female character, she loses her identity. And by loses, I mean one day she just doesn't exist anymore. All of her government information is gone. She can't get a license. She can't get a social security number. She just vanished out of existence. And then she ends up working with the doorman from her apartment building, and together they try to tackle this problem and figure out how to get her back into existence. And it's going to involve some scary Italian people, and it's going to involve a lot of really lovely old people. I just feel like this book felt very quirky and I loved it, okay? The magical realism element felt so gentle, so fun, and I loved the main characters a lot, especially because the main male character, he is like besties with a bunch of old people, and honestly, I loved it. I loved that dynamic. It was just so fun, and I feel like it's one that I don't see in a ton of books, so it was just an extra special kind of feeling. I just love this book, and I did not expect to love it as much as I really did. But now that I have talked about all of these honorable mentions, we are here for the main event, okay? It is time to go over my top 10 books of 2024. Are you ready? I don't know if I'm ready. I mean, I am ready because I thought about this for a long time, but even when I look at this list of top 10, sometimes I'm like, did I get this right or did I put them in the wrong order? But I feel pretty confident about the order that I have now. Okay, so we're gonna go through this. Starting at number 10, we have a romance entry, The Kiss Countdown by Etta Easton. This book, I read it and was kicking my feet and giggling while reading it. This is a fake dating situation, which, like I said, is one of my favorites, and I loved how it was done in this. It's an astronaut, okay? The main male character is an astronaut, and the main female character is a party planner, and they are going to fake date the heck out of it. They go camping because they are camping with his family, and that's just going to throw a wrench in all the dynamics because there's expectations there. I don't know what it was about this book, but something about it just hit me, and I loved it so very much. I was giggling. Like, I loved every moment of this book. So it is very, very deserving of being in my top 10. And now the next book, the number 9 book of 2024, A Court of Silver Flames. I honestly was surprised that this book made it into the list. I knew it would make it into my top collection, but in evaluating everything, making it to number 9, I don't think I would have predicted this. However, I cried 3 times in the last 100 pages of this book. 3 times in 100 pages. That's extreme, okay? But I loved this book. Is it enormous? Yes. But it was fantastic, and I had a fantastic time with it. Yes, it's very, very spicy, but I love Cassian and Nessa, okay? I love them. End of story. That's it. As a conclusion to what we have so far of the series, I loved it. I loved the dynamics. I loved all the characters getting to work together, the issues that they had to resolve. Okay, I loved this book. I had a fantastic time, and that's all that I'm gonna say. Next up is the other thriller. So I said that I only had 2 thrillers that made it into my top 24, and this is the second one. And this one I read as an ARC, but of course I bought it physically because I loved it so much. This Girl's a Killer by Emma C. Wells. This is a serial killer thriller, okay? But it's a serial killer of terrible people. The vigilante justice serial killer. The best kind, okay? I loved Cordelia in this book. I thought she was fun, she was witty, and we get some really, really amazing and beautiful dynamics in here. She has the found family down to an art. I love the people that she has in her life and the people that she is trying so hard to protect, which is what causes a lot of the issues in here when she finds that she has to kill somebody that is not easy to kill in her life, okay? But I love the way she did it. I love all of the secrecy and having to hide her identity and what she's doing, and then when she meets a cop, she has to hide from the cop. It's fantastic. I loved it. If you have not read this book, but you love a good vigilante justice kind of serial killer, please do yourself a favor and pick up this book. It was amazing, which is why it made its place into number 8 of 2024. Now we move on to the next one on the list, which is number 7. And this is where things get really tough because I reorganized this section of my list so many times. But number 7 is going to be The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I loved this book. This was so beautiful. I cried multiple times. The dynamic off the charts. The setting off the charts. We are following Linus, who goes to evaluate an orphanage, and when he gets there, he discovers that these kids are very different, and they are all together because they are considered dangerous by society. Well, Linus is going to learn just what these children are, and they are amazing. They are beautiful, and they are fantastic comedic and witty, and I just loved every single one of them. What made this book even better was the audiobook. I have to talk about it. I can't talk about this book without saying how good the audiobook was, because the voices brought every single character to life in a brand new way that made this story so incredible and like explosive. But I absolutely loved everything about this book. The real life issues that are brought to light in here, the relationship between Linus and Arthur as the caretaker for these kids, the father figure, the way that they end up coming together to really fight for these kids. I loved it. It was beautiful. And I read the sequel to this one as well, and it was just as delicious. It was amazing. I have no notes. It's so good. These kids all are unique types of magical children, and it's just so good, okay? It was so good. Why was I crying so many times? I really couldn't tell ya, but I was. But you want to know a book that I did not cry at? I did not cry at this book. I did gag a lot, and I definitely had my jaw dropped quite a few times while reading The Cotton Candy Massacre by Christopher Robertson. This comes in at number 6 on my list, and honestly, it was so deliciously gory. There must be something wrong with me for loving how absolutely disgusting this book was, but it was fantastic. And you wanna know what's even better? The fact that the sequel was just as good. I am putting these books together as number 6 because I can't really pick a favorite. I love everything that happened in book 1, but it was a little long. Book 2 was half the length and had all of the excitement. So I feel like together these are like the most perfect horror, splatterpunk kind of disgusting horror, and I was eating it up. This is about evil clowns that kill a bunch of people like viciously at a carnival. And then book 2 is when one of the clowns escapes and terrorizes people a little bit later on. Absolutely amazing. I freaking loved it. And yeah, there's not a whole lot else to say. The main draw of these books is how gory and disgusting they are, with so many very, very unique kills and things that have been in my mind since I read these books, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, okay? Yeah, the mental images are coming back as I speak. So I am going to move right on to the number 5 book on my list, An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. This is book 1 in the series, and it's the only one I've read so far, okay? But I loved this book, like obsessed. It was my favorite book of the month that I read it in, which I think was September, and I absolutely ate this book up. This is about a young woman who is on a mission to save her captured brother, and in doing so, she has to team up with some people who ask her, in, no polite terms, force her to become a spy for them and infiltrate basically like the main palace so that they can learn all the secrets and use her to further their agenda. The dynamics of the world building was so spectacularly done, and the characters are so well versed. I just feel like they were parsed out so well. Every single dynamic in this book felt so good and so strong. I honestly can't even pinpoint any one thing that stood out about how amazing this book was. It was just like, once I started reading, I could not put it down. It was so good. It was captivating. Like, this is the epitome of a captivating fantasy kind of story, and I am so excited to be able to read all of the rest of the books in the series. They are behind me here. I just haven't had a chance to get to them, but I cannot wait to be reading all of these this year. Like, it's one of my top goals. I will be reading those books this year because of how amazing it was. But now we move on to the next book on the list, okay? We are at number 4. This is the one that I teased a little bit earlier, and I said that it was another book in this Chestnut Springs series. It is Hopeless by Elsie Silver. This is the last book in the series, and I was so surprised to end up putting this one over Heartless. Heartless was my favorite for so long, but then I read this one. This one has a lot of dealing with trauma that I really loved. I thought it was done very beautifully. It was difficult to read at times, but that was part of what made it so beautiful, in seeing people come through and care for each other in new and really beautiful ways. Just in general, this book made me feel a lot of things. Anger, yes, but also just love and just a lot of really complicated feelings. I felt a lot during this book, and that is the sign of a really good romance, or a really good book in general, is when you have those like visceral feelings while reading, and that's what this book gave me. Now we get to my very top 3 books of the year, and these were so hard to figure out, but I put them in order, and I reverse them in order sometimes, but I think this is a pretty good order, and these are some of the ones that I have talked about all year, saying, oh, this is going to be one of my favorite books of the year. year. Okay, so it is one of my favorite books of the year. First up is Butcher and Blackbird at number 3. Brynne Weaver, you mastermind, you created a serial killer romance that had me giggling, cringing, gagging, feeling every single possible emotion. And this story just doesn't stop. Like, it is fast. There's things always happening, but also the romance that happens here is deliciously beautiful. It is very spicy. There's a lot of triggers to pay attention to, and there are certain foods that you cannot eat after reading this book without thinking about this book. There's also another scene that has nothing to do with food, but I think about it on the regular and it makes me laugh hysterically. It has to do with a corpse. I shouldn't be laughing at that, but I am, okay? It's so funny. It was so good. And I read this book like at the beginning of the year, like January or February. And the fact that it stayed at the top all this time tells you how much I love this book. I have 3 copies of it, okay? I have the paperback, I have the collector's edition, and I have the Darkly Bookish Box Darkly edition. Obsessed. I am obsessed with this book. Also, I didn't even say what it's about other than serial killers, but it's 2 serial killers who make it a competition to go kill other serial killers, and through doing that, over time, they fall for each other in the most gruesome of ways and beautiful, and I just loved it. But now we have to move on to book number 2, and this one, I honestly thought this was going to be book number 1. I'm not gonna lie to you, okay? I thought this was going to be number 1 for about 9 months of the year. This was probably my number 1 book of the year. It was dethroned, however, but I'm talking about Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. This is the second book in the Shepherd King duology. The first one is One Dark Window. Two Twisted Crowns ended up being my favorite. However, I loved both of them and gave them both 5 stars. But this one stuck with me. This one gave me a new favorite book boyfriend. If you know Elm, you know what I mean. I loved him in this book. This duology also has a really spectacular magic system where magical abilities are given based on like a deck of cards, and you have to have the card in order to tap into the ability that it gives. But there's also a like ranking of rarity with these cards, and basically everybody in the book is all trying to get the full set of the 12 cards, and there's going to be 2 sides of the argument, the good side and the bad side. But the main character in the first book, there's also a very dark, nightmarish kind of thing going on in her mind, and that is going to continue in this book. We're diving more into the nightmare, but in book 2 there is another relationship dynamic that's brought in that I loved even more, and it is why it's on this list. When I tell you, I was like, again, kicking my feet, screaming, giggling, having the most amazing time of my life. I could not stop smiling thinking about Elm after reading this book. I loved Elm, probably in an unhealthy way. I thought this was fantastic, and every single moment that he was in the book, I didn't want it to stop. Yeah, I think Elm in general is why this book made it to number 2, and I have no issues with that. But now we come to the grandiose moment where I reveal the number 1 book of the year. And this one shouldn't have been very surprising, honestly, because of the author. However, I didn't expect it to knock down both Two Twisted Crowns and Butcher and Blackbird, who were reigning at the top for the entire year. However, Say You'll Remember Me by Abby Jimenez. I had this as an ARC, okay? It's not even out yet. And this book ruined me. I cried probably more times than definitely more times than I'd like to admit, but more times than I have cried in any book in a long time. This book deals with a lot of trauma. It deals with a lot of real life problems and adult relationship conflict, but one of the characters deals with a family member with dementia, which really hit home for me, and that's what kind of tugged on the heartstrings enough to make me relate to this book a lot more and made it feel so much more real. But the story is about a vet and a social media manager who meet, and they don't get along right away, but then, you know, things change pretty quickly and they start developing this really, really beautiful relationship that ends up turning into a long distance relationship that they have to navigate. And I think the way they did it was so spectacular. I think it can be done really, really poorly in a lot of books that I read, and in this one it was done perfectly. I was loving the real way that they approached their problems. They had such healthy communication. I think this book was the healthiest romance communication I've ever experienced in a book. I loved it so, so much. The way it made me, again, feel things was just incredible. Again, no notes. I just loved this book so much, and I'm so excited for people to get to read it this year when it comes out because it was amazing. Okay. that is it. I have talked enough about all of these books. These have been my top 24 of 24, and it feels like a huge weight off of my chest to finally have revealed them because of how long it took me to figure out what they were going to be. But I'm so happy with this list. I'm so happy with all the books that I read this year and how many I loved. All of these were 5 stars. I love them so, so much. As always, I want to thank you so much for being here, for watching this video, for every moment that you spend here supporting me. I appreciate it so, so much. If you have read any of these books and you also loved them, I would love to scream about them with you. Please leave me a comment. Let me know what you've thought of these books. If you have not read some of them and you are interested in picking them up, please let me know that as well. I would absolutely love to hear your excitement to try some of these now because I loved them. Obviously, they made this list because I love them so much. So I hope that you will consider picking them up as well. If you like this video and you want to see more from me, please hit that subscribe button so that you can follow along with everything that I have coming up in the future. I want to thank you for being here and invite you to keep coming along this journey with me. But for now, this has been my top 24 of 24. I hope that I will see you in the next video. Bye!